The following script is a fictional story designed for a voiceover generator. It is inspired by themes of racial bias, legal challenge, and ultimate vindication, focusing on a young black woman's journey to reverse a judicial decision against her father. The courtroom of Judge Thomas Hawthorne was a place where tradition was weaponized. Hawthorne, a man whose lineage traced back to the earliest colonial governors, saw himself as the last bastion of true, unassailable authority. He presided with a blend of aristocratic boredom and casual cruelty, particularly when the defendants represented a demographic he fundamentally considered beneath him. And so, when 16-year-old Sarah Miller stepped forward to address the court on behalf of her father, the air in the room thickened with the promise of humiliation. Sarah's father, Elias Miller, was a respected but struggling mechanic who had lost a protracted, messy civil suit brought by a wealthy real estate developer over a complex zoning dispute. Elias, unable to afford consistent high-level representation, had watched his meager life savings and his small business property, the only home his family had ever known, slowly slip away. The final appeal hearing was a formality. Sarah was not a lawyer. She was a high school junior, known in her neighborhood for her relentless focus, her perfect grades, and a mind that devoured textbooks, particularly those concerning constitutional law. She had spent the last 2 months of her life sleeping only 4 hours a night, meticulously poring over every transcript, every legal precedent, and every obscure footnote related to the case. When the bailiff called for the defense's final brief statement, Sarah stood up. She was dressed in her best blazer, a sharp contrast to the gray hopelessness that usually pervaded the defense's corner. Judge Hawthorne glanced down at the diminutive figure, barely visible behind the defense table, and a sneer twitched the corner of his mouth. "And who, pray tell, are you?" Hawthorne drawled, his voice loud and patronizing. "A child? We are not admitting testimony from minors, counselor, unless you plan to request a recess for a nap." A wave of low, sycophantic laughter rippled from the prosecution's side. Sarah did not flinch. She met the judge's cold, dismissive blue eyes with her own steady, intelligent dark gaze. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice ringing clear and steady in the oak-paneled room. "I am Seraphina Miller. I am the daughter of the defendant, Elias Miller, and I am here as his next friend representative, pursuant to Article 7 of the state's Civil Procedure Act, Section 4.1. Hawthorne's sneer deepened. "A next friend representative. How charmingly quaint. Are you perhaps going to recite a poem? Or perhaps read us a passage from some inspirational children's book? Because frankly, Miss Miller, this court deals with law, not sentimentality." He leaned back, crossing his arms, clearly enjoying the spectacle of his own power. "State your case, child. Make it brief. I have lunch reservations." The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. The courtroom observer shuffled uneasily, anticipating the quick, brutal shutdown. Sarah opened a large, worn binder. She ignored the mockery. She ignored the systemic weight of the room. She only saw the law. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, holding the judge's gaze, "I will be brief, as the law itself is brief. We are not appealing on factual grounds. We are appealing on a singular, procedural matter regarding the court's interpretation of Subdivision C of the eminent domain just compensation statute of 1982. Hawthorne rolled his eyes dramatically, sighing loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "Oh, good Lord. Subdivision C, the darling of bored legal interns. And what fantasy interpretation has the high school class devised this time, Miss Miller?" Sarah paused, letting the silence swallow his sarcasm. "Your Honor, the statute clearly defines just compensation, as including the market value of the property plus all demonstrable future earning losses accrued over a period of not less than 3 fiscal years following the condemnation, specifically in cases involving small, family-owned essential services." Yes, we know the text," Hawthorne interrupted, waving a bored hand. "But established precedent, as reaffirmed by Jenkins v. State Board of Zoning, 2008, clearly limits future earning losses only to enterprises with established quarterly stock valuation, a clear distinction to prevent frivolous claims from, shall we say, corner businesses." He emphasized the last phrase with a deliberate, condescending flick of his hand toward Elias Miller. The temperature in the room dropped. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her posture. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a serious, almost academic pitch. "With all due respect, Jenkins versus State Board of Zoning is not the controlling precedent here. And in fact, the very language used by this court to cite it is fundamentally flawed." The courtroom hushed entirely. No one had ever challenged Hawthorne's legal authority, especially not on technical grounds, and certainly not a teenager. Hawthorne blinked, his boredom momentarily replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. "Be very careful, Miss Miller. You are challenging a 15-year-old ruling cited in every major land use case." "I am challenging its foundation, Your Honor," Sarah insisted. The Jenkins decision itself relies heavily on the definition of established quarterly stock valuation as set out in Section 114 of the State Commercial Code of 1999. She flipped a page in her binder and pointed to a passage highlighted in bright yellow. Section 114 of the Commercial Code was repealed in 2012 by the state legislature's Commercial Modernization Act. A murmur swept through the room. The prosecution team, confident moments ago, suddenly looked extremely nervous, shuffling through their own briefs. Hawthorne remained stone-faced, but a thin vein pulsed at his temple. "That is a minor administrative footnote. Miss Miller, it does not vacate the weight of the Jenkins precedent itself, which has been applied hundreds of times since 2012. "It does, Your Honor," Sarah countered, her voice now brimming with the confidence of absolute, irrefutable knowledge. "Because the Jenkins ruling in its entirety is a derivative judgment, meaning its operative definition is wholly dependent on the repeal code. Under State Supreme Court Rule 19, subsection A, any derivative judgment whose core definitional dependency is rendered void by a subsequent legislative act is subject to ab initio reversal." She looked at her father, who stared at her with a mix of terror and awe. Then she looked back at Hawthorne, delivering the final, crushing blow. "The Jenkins ruling is legally void, Your Honor. It is not precedent. It is a nullity. If Jenkins is a nullity, then this court is obligated to apply the plain language of the 1982 statute, which clearly entitles my father, an owner of an essential family-owned service, to future earning losses over 3 fiscal years. You cannot legally use a voided ruling to deny him his compensation." The silence that followed was absolute. The prosecution's lead counsel, a well-paid lawyer named Peterson, leaned over to his junior associate and whispered, "Check the Commercial Modernization Act. Now." Judge Hawthorne, his face a roadmap of cold fury and dawning realization, slammed his gavel down, not in triumph, but in a desperate bid for
control. Order. Order in this court. He fixed Sarah with a stare that promised retribution. He had been blindsided, out-lawyered, and humiliated in his own courtroom by a teenager. Worse, a black teenager, the very symbol of the dilution he secretly despised. "Miss Miller," Hawthorne sneered, the venom clear in his voice. "That is a fascinating, if purely academic, argument. This court will take the matter under advisement. However, let me assure you, this courtroom is not a law school debate club. We deal with real power and established order. And your theatrical performance will change nothing. Now, sit down." Sarah nodded slowly. She knew the threat was empty. She had used the law itself, the ultimate, objective structure, to strip him of his authority. Over the next 72 hours, the legal system performed a panicked scramble of damage control. The prosecution's frantic research confirmed Sarah's precise analysis. The repeal of the Commercial Code Section 114 had indeed created a long-ignored legal loophole, effectively making the Jenkins precedent, the bedrock of their entire case, legally invalid for derivative application. The case was not just about Elias Miller anymore. It was about exposing a systemic error that had potentially denied just compensation to thousands of small business owners across the state for over a decade. 3 days later, the court reconvened. The room was packed with reporters and legal scholars. Judge Hawthorne sat rigid on the bench, his face etched with fatigue and contained rage. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at Elias. He looked only at the papers before him. This court has reviewed the arguments presented in the final appeal of Miller v. The State Zoning Authority. Hawthorne's voice was low, flat, and defeated. Specifically, the challenge regarding the continued validity of the Jenkins v. State Board of Zoning precedent. He cleared his throat. The defense's argument, challenging the core definitional dependency of Jenkins based on the 2012 repeal of Section 114 of the Commercial Code, is legally sound. The word sound was the most bitter admission of defeat he could utter. Therefore, the Jenkins ruling is deemed to have been null and void ab initio for derivative application in cases concerning subdivision C. The previous ruling against the defendant, Elias Miller, is hereby reversed. A roar erupted in the courtroom. Elias Miller collapsed into his chair, weeping tears of relief. Reporters scrambled out the doors. Judge Hawthorne slammed his gavel one last time, a final, futile gesture of control. He looked up, his gaze finally settling on Serafina Miller. Sarah did not smile. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement that the law, when wielded correctly, was blind to the color of the person holding it. Hawthorne said nothing more, rising stiffly and walking back to his chambers, the last vestiges of his authority stripped away by the very code he swore to uphold. Serafina Miller had not just saved her father, she had overturned a decade of flawed legal precedent, forcing the state to reckon with its own law, all because a judge had once mocked a young woman for daring to open a law book. Her act of defiance became a landmark legal challenge, ensuring that thousands of families like hers would receive the just compensation that was always their right. She was not a lawyer, but on that day, she was the ultimate master of the